A black man in civilian clothes stood zip-tied to a metal pole outside Precinct 91 on an ordinary afternoon, left there like a joke. Cars passed by. Pedestrians stared. 3 officers stood nearby, laughing so hard that one of them had to wipe tears from his face. A cell phone recorded everything. What none of those officers knew, what would destroy their careers, their reputations, and in one case their marriage, was that the man tied to that pole was carrying a letter in his jacket pocket, a letter signed by the mayor of Carlisle, Tennessee, appointing him chief of police effective that very morning. The city of Carlisle, Tennessee, had not had a black police chief in its 140-year history. That fact alone made the appointment of Marcus Ellison headline news when Mayor Thomas Reed announced it one bright morning. The press conference was polished, the talking points rehearsed, and the handshake photographs were taken from many different angles. Reed, a square-jawed man with silver hair and the kind of permanent tan that comes from too many golf weekends, smiled broadly beside Ellison and told every camera in the room that this was a new chapter for Carlisle. Marcus Ellison was 44 years old. He had spent many years in law enforcement, first as a beat cop in Memphis, then as a detective in Nashville, then as deputy chief of a mid-sized department in Knoxville that had, under his leadership, reduced violent crime by a significant margin in several years. He had a master's degree in criminology from Vanderbilt. He had 2 daughters, a son, a mortgage, a golden retriever named Scout, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had been underestimated his entire professional life and had learned to treat that as an advantage. He was also, at 6 feet and 210 pounds, a physically imposing man. But on the morning of his first official day, he was not wearing his uniform. He was not wearing a badge. He had decided deliberately and thoughtfully to spend that first official day driving through the city before reporting to the precinct to see Carlisle the way its residents saw it, without the armor of rank. He wore dark jeans, a navy pullover, and white sneakers. He carried his wallet, his phone, and a sealed envelope from the mayor's office containing his official letter of appointment, which he had been meaning to drop at the precinct for the administrative staff. He had not yet been formally introduced to the officers of Precinct 9. That introduction was scheduled for the following morning at a department-wide assembly. None of that mattered that afternoon. What mattered was that his car, a silver Ford Explorer with out-of-town plates, was parked in front of a corner store on Delmar Street, half a block from Precinct 9, and 2 officers on routine patrol thought that was suspicious enough to investigate. Officer Derek Harlan had been with the Carlisle Police Department for many years. He was stocky, with a jaw like a cinder block, and eyes the color of old nickels. He had received several formal complaints in his career, including ones for excessive force and a racial slur caught on body cam, and had survived all of them with nothing more permanent than a note in his file and a week of mandatory sensitivity training that he had loudly, publicly mocked at the bar afterward. His partner that day was Officer Nolan Pierce, who had been on the force for several years and had, in that time, attached himself to Harlan like a remora to a shark. Nolan was not a cruel man by nature. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a man without strong enough convictions to push back against cruelty when it was standing right next to him wearing a badge. The 3rd officer was Seth Langford, who was technically off-duty and had stopped by the patrol car to talk. Seth had a reputation around the precinct for what his colleagues generously called pranks, handcuffing rookie officers to their chairs, leaving fake disciplinary notices in lockers, once releasing a live possum into the break room. He was the kind of man who mistook cruelty for comedy, and had never once in his adult life been made to feel the cost of the difference. When they spotted Marcus Ellison walking back toward his Explorer from the corner store, a water bottle in one hand and his phone in the other, Derek Harlan slowed the cruiser. "Who's that?" he said. Nolan looked. "Don't know him. Out-of-state plates on that Explorer. Could be anybody," Nolan said, though his voice already carried the flattened tone of a man preemptively agreeing. Derek pulled over. What happened next was reconstructed later from 3 sources. Marcus Ellison's own account, the body camera footage from Nolan Pierce's unit. Derek's had been malfunctioning for several weeks, a fact that would later become a separate investigation entirely, and a short video recorded by a woman named Elena Vargas, who was sitting on the front steps of her grandmother's house across the street and had the presence of mind to hit record before she even fully understood what she was seeing. Derek got out of the cruiser first. He approached Ellison with his thumbs in his belt, the particular swagger of a man who had decided the outcome of an encounter before it began. "Hey, this your vehicle?" Marcus turned calmly. "Yes, sir." "You live around here?" "No, I'm visiting the area." He kept his voice level. He had been having this kind of conversation since he was a teenager, and he had learned through painful and repeated experience that calm was both armor and strategy. "Visiting who?" "I have business at the precinct." That answer should have ended it. It did not. Derek asked for ID. Marcus provided his Tennessee driver's license. Derek looked at it, handed it to Nolan without a word, and Nolan ran it through the system. It came back clean. Of course it came back clean. It had never not come back clean. But by then, Seth Langford had wandered over. And Seth Langford, who was bored and off-duty and had already had a couple of drinks at lunch, looked at Marcus Ellison standing on the sidewalk in his jeans and sneakers, looked at Derek, and grinned. "What's he doing hanging around the precinct?" Seth said, as if Marcus were not standing 3 feet away. "That's what we're figuring out," Derek replied in the same third-person erasure. Marcus said quietly, "I'm right here. You can ask me directly." That was the moment the temperature changed. What followed happened quickly. The official account, the one the department initially tried to file, described it as a precautionary restraint during an investigative stop. The body cam footage told a different story. Derek grabbed Ellison's arm. There was a brief, sharp argument. Marcus did not resist. He was meticulous about not resisting because he knew what happened to black men who resisted even slightly. But he also did not shrink, and that stillness, that refusal to become small, seemed to infuriate Derek in a way that resistance might not have. Seth produced a set of zip ties from his off-duty cargo pants, a detail that would later prompt the question of why an off-duty officer was carrying zip ties at all, a question that opened a door nobody wanted opened. They walked Marcus Ellison to the metal signpost outside Precinct 9, the one that read Carlisle Police Department, and zip-tied his wrists around it. And then they laughed. Seth took a photo on his personal phone. Nolan looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Derek crouched down to Marcus's eye level and said, in a voice too low for the body cam to pick up clearly, but not low enough to escape Elena Vargas's phone across the street, "Welcome to Carlisle." Marcus Ellison looked back at him with an expression that Elena Vargas would later describe to every reporter who interviewed her as the face of a man who knew something you did not. She was right. Marcus Ellison did not tell them who he was right away. Later people would ask him why in interviews, in opinion pieces that debated his choice from every conceivable angle, at the town hall that Mayor Thomas Reed convened in the gymnasium of Carlisle High School, weeks after the incident. His answer was always the same, delivered with the same quiet precision. "Because it shouldn't have mattered," he said. "If I had been a plumber from Knoxville, what they did would have been just as wrong. I needed them to understand that. I needed everyone to understand that." So he stood zip-tied to the pole for several minutes. During those minutes, 3 things happened. First, a small crowd gathered. Carlisle was not a large city, the kind of place where something happening on one street was known on the next street. Within minutes, people stopped. Some took photos. A few spoke to the officers, asking what was going on, and were told to move along. Most moved along. Second, Elena Vargas's video hit social media. She posted it with the caption, "Carlisle PD just zip-tied a black man to their own sign for no reason while they laughed about it. This is not okay. Someone needs to see this." It spread rapidly. By the time the local news station sent a reporter to Delmar Street, it had passed millions of views and was climbing. Third, and this is where the story pivots on its axis, Captain Reginald Thornton of Precinct 9 received a phone call from the mayor's office. The mayor's chief of staff, a sharp, efficient woman named Clara Benson, had seen the video. She had recognized the corner of Delmar and 5th. She had recognized the man tied to the pole. "Reginald," Clara Benson said, and her voice was the particular tone of someone managing a catastrophe in real time. Please tell me your officers did not just zip tie the new chief of police to your front sign. Reginald Thornton was 61 years old, several years from retirement, and had survived many years in law enforcement through a combination of competence, adaptability, and an almost supernatural ability to sense which way the wind was blowing. The wind at that moment was a hurricane. He ran outside. Marcus Ellison was still standing at the pole when Reginald Thornton came through the front door of Precinct 9 at a pace that was almost, but not quite a run. Derek Harlan and Seth Langford were still nearby. Nolan Pierce had retreated to the cruiser where he was sitting with the window up, and the expression of a man who had just watched himself make the worst decision of his life and was now waiting for the consequences to arrive. Reginald Thornton looked at Marcus Ellison. Marcus Ellison looked at Reginald Thornton. "Captain Thornton," Marcus said pleasantly. "I was wondering when someone would come out." Thornton's face went through several distinct phases in approximately 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, horror, calculation, and then a studied blankness that was the professional mask of a man trying very hard not to visibly panic. "Get him down," Thornton said to nobody in particular. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Derek Harlan, who had not yet understood what was happening, said, "Cap, we were just—" "Get him down." Thornton did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Nolan Pierce cut the zip ties. Marcus Ellison rolled his wrists, which were slightly red but uninjured, and reached into his jacket pocket. He produced the sealed envelope from the mayor's office and held it out to Reginald Thornton. "I was actually coming to drop this off," he said. "Administrative staff were expecting it." Thornton took the envelope. His hands, Marcus would later note, were not entirely steady. Inside was the letter of appointment. Chief Marcus Ellison, effective that morning. Thornton read it. He looked up at Marcus. He looked at Derek Harlan, who had finally visibly understood. Derek's face had gone the color of old paper. "Chief Ellison," Thornton said, and the word chief landed in the air between all of them like a stone dropped into still water. "I am deeply, deeply sorry." Marcus nodded once. "I know you are, Captain," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow at the assembly." He looked briefly at Derek Harlan, then at Seth Langford, then at Nolan Pierce, still sitting in the cruiser. His gaze was not angry. It was something more unsettling than anger. It was patient. He walked to his silver Explorer, got in, and drove away. By evening that day, the video had millions of views. By late night, CNN had a segment. By even later, Fox News had a segment. By midnight, every major network had a segment, and the segments were saying different things about the same video, but all of them were saying it loudly. And Carlisle, Tennessee, a city that most Americans could not have located on a map 24 hours earlier, was suddenly the only place anyone was talking about. In a house on Burwood Lane, Derek Harlan sat at his kitchen table with his wife Sophia across from him. Sophia had seen the video. Sophia had seen the news. Sophia was not speaking, which was, in Derek's experience, far worse than if she had been shouting. "I didn't know who he was," Derek said for the third time. "That's not the point," Sophia said for the third time. Her voice was very quiet. "We thought he was what? What did you think he was, Derek?" She looked at him with an expression he did not recognize, which frightened him because he had known her for many years and thought he had cataloged every expression she was capable of. This one was new. It looked like the moment someone decides something. "What exactly did you think a black man standing on a public sidewalk with a water bottle was?" Derek did not answer. "What did you say to him when you crouched down? I could see your mouth moving on that video." "Nothing," Derek said. "You said something." "Derek." Her voice broke slightly on the single syllable and then reassembled itself. "I have 2 sons, your sons, who are going to grow up and be black men standing on sidewalks, and I need you to tell me right now what you said." The silence that followed lasted a long time. Sophia Harlan took her car keys from the counter and left. She did not come back that night. She would, weeks later, file for divorce. In an apartment across town, Seth Langford was on his phone with his union rep, Garrett Falk, who was explaining in a careful, measured voice that the zip ties were going to be the central problem, and the photograph on Seth's personal phone was going to be the second central problem, and the fact that Seth was off duty was going to be the third central problem, and that Garrett was going to need Seth to stop talking to anyone at all, until they had met in person. Seth agreed. Then he called his brother, then his mother, then his college roommate. By the time Garrett Falk found out, Seth had told the story to several people, and every version was slightly different, and two of those people had told other people, and one of them had told a journalist. In the precinct parking lot, Nolan Pierce sat in his personal car for over an hour without starting the engine. He was in his late 20s. He had a baby daughter named Harper, several months old, who was home with his wife, Elena. He had wanted to be a police officer since he was a child. He had wanted to do good. He could not, sitting in that parking lot, account for the distance between who he had wanted to be and what he had done, or rather what he had failed to do, which felt worse than the doing. He called Elena. "I need to tell you something," he said. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No," he said. "Come home," she said. "Come home and we'll figure it out." He drove home. That phone call, that choice to be honest with his wife in the immediate hours after the incident, would turn out to be the beginning of the only decision Nolan Pierce made in the entire affair that he would not later regret. And in a hotel room on the east side of Carlisle, a hotel he had checked into that morning before his drive through the city, Marcus Ellison sat on the edge of the bed and watched the news on the television mounted to the wall. He watched himself on the screen. The Elena Vargas footage played again and again, and he felt something complicated. Not exactly anger, not triumph, something more like grief, the particular grief of a man who had been proven right about something he desperately wished he had been wrong about. He called his wife, Elena, who was still in Knoxville with their children waiting to move to Carlisle the following weekend. "I saw," she said immediately when she picked up. "I know," he said. "Are you hurt?" "No." Elena's voice carried everything that the word alone could not. Their entire history, every conversation they had ever had about this specific category of danger, every time he had left for work, and she had let him go without saying what she was thinking, because saying it made it more real. "I'm okay," he said. "I promise." "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen. "My job," he said. The next morning at the department-wide assembly, the room at Precinct 9 held many officers, and every one of them was there. The room was the particular kind of quiet that is not actually silence, but the collective holding of breath. Captain Reginald Thornton stood to one side. Mayor Thomas Reed was in the front row, which was unusual enough to signal to everyone present that this was not a routine introduction. Clara Benson stood behind the mayor with a face like a closed door. Two representatives from the police commission sat along the wall. A department attorney was in the back. And at the front of the room, at the podium, stood Marcus Ellison. He was in uniform, the uniform of the chief of police of Carlisle, Tennessee. Stars on the collar, the Carlisle PD badge on the chest. He had been up since early morning putting it on, and he had stood in front of the hotel mirror for a while, and then he had put it on. He let the silence run for a moment after Reginald introduced him. He looked at the room. He found Derek Harlan in the crowd, third row, far left, in a collared shirt, because he had been pulled from duty pending investigation. He found Seth Langford, who was not present because he was home under the instruction of his union rep. He found Nolan Pierce, who was in the room in uniform and who met his gaze directly and did not look away. Marcus appreciated that. Not the action, the looking, the willingness to be seen in the aftermath. "Yesterday," Marcus began, and his voice was even, measured and carried to every corner of the room without effort. "I was restrained without cause by 3 members of this department and secured to a pole outside your building. Nobody moved. I want to be direct with you about something. I'm not standing here this morning as a victim. I have been a police officer for many years, and I have known in that time that a moment like yesterday was not a question of if, it was a question of when and what I would do when it came." He paused. "This is what I'm going to do." He spoke for over half an hour. The speech was later published in full by the Carlisle Gazette, then reprinted by the Washington Post, then read aloud by two different senators in two different contexts for two entirely different reasons. It addressed accountability. It addressed systemic failure. It addressed the difference between an incident and a culture and the work required to know which one you were looking at. It was not a speech about punishment. It was a speech about the department he intended to build and what it would cost everyone in the room, including himself, to build it. When he finished, the room was quiet again. Then Captain Reginald Thornton, 61 years old and several years from retirement, stood up and began to clap. It was slow at first. A few officers joined, then more. By the time the applause was full, it was not unanimous. Derek Harlan's hands were in his lap, and three other officers Marcus made note of were similarly still, but it was substantial and it was real. And Marcus Ellison received it without smiling, because this was not a moment for smiling. This was a moment for beginning. But the applause was the last easy thing that happened for a very long time. The internal affairs investigation into the incident began the same day as the assembly, and was from the start unlike any investigation the Carlisle Police Department had previously conducted. Not because the oversight was external, though the State Attorney General's office did eventually send a monitor, but because the new chief of police was himself the victim of the incident under review, a situation for which departmental policy had no established protocol. Marcus Ellison recused himself from the disciplinary process. He made that decision without being asked, and announced it publicly before anyone could demand it, which closed the door on an entire class of criticism before it could be opened. He appointed a review board that included Captain Thornton, Commissioner Alice Brandt, and Dr. Gideon Hayes, a criminologist from Tennessee State who specialized in police accountability. He then stepped back and let them work. What they found was worse than the video. Derek Harlan's body camera had not been malfunctioning. A forensic review of the unit found that it had been manually deactivated, a violation that carried criminal implications entirely separate from the incident itself. The deactivation was logged minutes before the encounter with Ellison. Derek's explanation was that he had done it by accident. The review board did not find this credible. Seth Langford's personal phone contained the photograph of Marcus Ellison at the pole, but it also contained a text thread from that same afternoon. The thread was between Seth and a group of several other officers, a group they had named with the creative poverty of men who thought they were being funny. The Yard. The texts included commentary about the encounter with Ellison, including two that were without any interpretation required explicitly racial in their language. The Yard text thread became the second investigation. Of the several other officers in the thread, two had been with the department for over a decade. One had commendations. One had been nominated the previous year for an Officer of the Year award, which he had not won, but whose nomination now read in light of his texts as a kind of institutional indictment. The investigation into the Yard's communications eventually expanded to include a review of cases each officer had been involved in over the prior several years: use of force incidents, arrests in predominantly black neighborhoods, complaint records. The results of that review were released in a lengthy report months after the incident. The report was called the Thornton-Hayes Assessment, and it documented a pattern, not a conspiracy. It was specific about that, but a pattern, a culture in which certain behaviors were tolerated, certain complaints were misdirected, and certain officers had accumulated a record that, laid out sequentially, should have prompted intervention years earlier. Several officers resigned before the report was released. Several were terminated. Several faced criminal charges. Derek Harlan for the body camera deactivation. Seth Langford for 2 charges of falsifying arrest records in unrelated cases that the expanded review had surfaced. And a third officer, Dale Pruitt, who had been the most senior member of the Yard Group and whose case was the most severe, involving what the state attorney described as a pattern of racially motivated conduct spanning many years. Dale Pruitt had been given the Officer of the Year nomination. Derek Harlan lost his badge, his pension, and weeks before the criminal charges were filed, his wife, Sophia Harlan, took their 2 sons to her mother's house out of state and did not return. Derek spent a night in a cell that was by every account indistinguishable from the kind of cell he had put other men in for far less. He later told a journalist in an interview that he perhaps should not have given, that the night in custody had been the worst experience of his life. The journalist, a woman named Priya Denton, who had covered criminal justice for many years and had the patience of someone who had interviewed many men who did not understand the size of what they had done, wrote down what he said and published it without comment. The readers commented for him. Seth Langford was convicted on one of the 2 falsifying charges. The second was dropped as part of a plea agreement and received a sentence of probation, a fine, and a permanent bar from law enforcement work in the state of Tennessee. The photograph on his phone of Marcus Ellison at the poll was entered into evidence and later became the central image of a civil rights exhibition at the Carlisle Public Library, displayed alongside a description of the case and its outcome. Seth had to drive past the library on his way to his new job at a logistics company in a nearby city. Nolan Pierce was a more complex case. He had not initiated the encounter. He had not applied the zip ties. He had not taken the photo, and he was not in the yard text group, but he had been present. He had run Ellison's ID, a fact the review board noted carefully, because running an ID is a choice, and the choice to run the ID of a man who had given no reasonable cause for suspicion was itself a part of the machinery of the encounter. He had also, within 48 hours of the incident, submitted a voluntary statement to Internal Affairs that was more detailed, more honest, and more damning to his own role than anything that had been compelled from the other officers involved. He had done this without being asked, without being told to, without, as far as anyone could determine, any expectation that it would protect him, because, as he told the review board when asked why, it was just true, and I thought the truth mattered more than whether it helped me. The review board suspended Nolan Pierce for 2 months without pay, required him to complete several months of additional training, and placed him on a 2-year probationary watch. It was the lightest consequence of anyone involved. Marcus Ellison, when he was asked by a journalist whether he thought Nolan's treatment had been appropriate, paused for a long time before answering. "I think accountability should be proportional," he said finally. "And I think honesty, when it costs you something, should be recognized, not rewarded. Recognized. There's a difference. The thing about a city is that it does not stop while its institutions are being rebuilt. Life continued in Carlisle. Children went to school. Restaurants opened. The Carlisle Mudcats, the city's minor league baseball team, played home games that spring, and the stadium was full most nights. But something had shifted. The shift was subtle in the way that all real shifts are subtle. Not a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 small adjustments in behavior, in language, in the way people held themselves in their interactions with the department. Marcus Ellison held his first community town hall in the gymnasium of Carlisle High. Hundreds of people showed up, a number that meant in a city of many thousands that the meeting had filtered through networks and conversations and personal urgency, and that people had decided to come. He sat at a folding table with no podium and fielded questions for several hours without notes. A woman named Dorothy Vargas, in her late 60s, who had lived in the Delmar Street neighborhood for many years, asked him why she should believe anything would actually change. Marcus thought about the question for a moment. "You shouldn't just believe it," he said. "You should watch. And if what you watch doesn't match what I'm telling you, I want you back in this room telling me so." Dorothy Vargas nodded slowly. She came to every subsequent community town hall. She eventually joined the new Civilian Oversight Committee that Marcus established that fall. The Oversight Committee, 5 civilians rotating annually with real authority to review complaint files and disciplinary outcomes, was one of several structural changes Marcus implemented in his first year. The others ranged from mandatory body camera audits to revised use of force reporting requirements to a new community liaison program that placed officers in non-enforcement roles in each of the city's neighborhoods for a minimum of several hours per week, with the full backing of Mayor Thomas Reed, and that all officers undergo an implicit bias assessment, not as a punishment and not as a public spectacle, but as baseline professional data, the same way a department might assess an officer's physical fitness or firearms proficiency. The assessments were conducted by Dr. Gideon Hayes' research team at Tennessee State and were confidential between the officer and the department. Several officers declined the assessment and resigned. Marcus let them go without comment. Captain Reginald Thornton did not resign. He stayed for his remaining years, and he became, in ways that surprised him, one of Marcus's more reliable allies. Reginald was not a man who changed easily. Many years of pattern do not dissolve overnight, but he was a man who was capable, when he looked at a thing clearly enough, of being ashamed of it. And he had looked at what his precinct had allowed to happen for years, had looked at it with the clarity that only catastrophic exposure can provide, and he was genuinely ashamed. He turned that shame into work, which was the only thing a man in his position could honestly do. He retired the following spring with a small ceremony in the break room and a card signed by every officer in the precinct. Marcus attended. He shook Reginald's hand and said something that nobody else in the room heard. Reginald nodded once. Whatever it was, it seemed to be the right thing. Elena Vargas was in her early 20s, and she had been sitting on her grandmother's front steps because her grandmother, Dorothy Vargas, in her late 70s, needed someone with her in the afternoons while she recovered from hip surgery, and Elena had taken time off from her job at the pharmacy on Central to stay with her. Elena had not set out to change anything. She had seen something wrong and pointed her phone at it, the same reflex that young people in the digital age carry in their fingers without thinking. She had not anticipated what would follow: the interview requests, the profile in a national magazine, the invitation to speak at a panel at Vanderbilt, the lawsuit deposition. Not her lawsuit. She was a witness. The strange and disorienting experience of becoming a symbol for something that had happened in front of her in a short video. She handled it with a grace that most older adults could not have managed. What she said consistently to every reporter and panel moderator and podcast host who asked her what she had been thinking when she hit record was, "I was thinking that someone had to see this. That's all." She did not claim heroism. She did not monetize her footage beyond the reasonable licensing fee she negotiated through a media attorney that her uncle found. She donated a portion of that fee to the Carlisle Legal Aid Society, which provided representation to low-income residents in police misconduct cases. The rest, she said in an interview with the Carlisle Gazette, went toward her grandmother's post-surgical care costs. Dorothy Vargas, for her part, told the Gazette that Elena had been watching too many true crime videos, and that this was what happened when young people did not go to bed at a reasonable hour. Dorothy was the most popular person quoted in the article. The relationship between Elena Vargas and Marcus Ellison in the aftermath was not the dramatic movie-ready friendship that people seemed to expect and perhaps wanted. They met once formally at the town hall when Marcus sought her out specifically and thanked her personally for what she had done. She said that she hoped things would get better. He said he intended to make them better. They shook hands. That was it. Elena Vargas went back to her job at the pharmacy. Marcus Ellison went back to rebuilding a police department. Two people doing their actual work in the actual world, which is how most real stories end, and which is less satisfying than the movies, but more honest than the alternative. Mayor Thomas Reed had presented himself throughout the entire affair as a man of progressive conviction. The appointment of Marcus Ellison had been his decision, and he had made it genuinely and with some courage. Carlisle was not a city where such an appointment was politically costless, and Reed had made it anyway, which was worth crediting. But Reed was also a politician. And in the weeks after the incident, as the story's national footprint expanded and the pressure from various constituencies intensified, he sometimes said things that were slightly different depending on the audience. To the city's black community, he spoke about systemic reform and his unwavering support for Chief Ellison. To the police union, he spoke about the complexity of law enforcement and the importance of due process. To the national press, he spoke about Carlisle as a city of courage and progress. To the business community, he spoke about stability and the city's investment climate. None of these things were individually untrue. Together, they added up to a portrait of a man who was trying to be all things to all people, which is a coherent short-term strategy and an incoherent long-term identity. Marcus Ellison noticed. He said nothing publicly because his job was not to manage the mayor's character. His job was to run the police department. But in private conversations with Elena, with his former colleague Wendell Thornton from Knoxville, who called regularly to check in, he expressed a clear-eyed assessment of what Reed was. "He did the right thing getting me here," Marcus told Wendell. I'm not sure he knew he was doing the right thing, or if he was doing the strategically interesting thing, but the right thing got done. I'll take it. Reed ran for re-election the following year. His primary was more competitive than expected, challenged from his left by a city council member named Tamara Voss, whose campaign centered specifically on the gap between Reed's public positions and his political triangulations. Reed won the primary by a narrow margin, which was significantly tighter than his previous margin. He won the general election comfortably. He and Marcus Ellison maintained a functional professional relationship. They were not friends. They did not need to be. The anniversary of the incident arrives the way anniversaries always do, quietly, without ceremony, until the world decides to make it loud again. By early morning on the second anniversary of the incident, Marcus Ellison's phone had already received dozens of messages, interview requests from 2 national outlets, a congratulatory text from Mayor Reed that used the word milestone twice in 3 sentences, a voice message from his former deputy chief back in Knoxville, Wendell Thornton, that simply said, "Still standing, brother. Call me when you get a minute." A long, rambling email from a criminology student at Tennessee State who wanted to write his thesis on the Carlisle transformation and needed 20 minutes of Marcus's time, which Marcus's assistant would later schedule as a 30-minute slot because the student sounded earnest, and earnestness deserved rounding up. Marcus read through none of them in any depth. He set the phone face down on the breakfast table, poured himself a second cup of coffee, and watched through the kitchen window as his daughter, Jada, in her mid-teens, attempted to parallel park the family's second car in the driveway for the 11th consecutive morning. She still could not do it cleanly. She got closer every day. He had learned in the past several months of watching her practice that there was something almost meditative about watching someone fail at a thing repeatedly and keep trying anyway. He found it one of the more encouraging things in his life. Elena came in from the back of the house with a laundry basket and set it on the counter and looked at him. They had been married for many years. After many years, certain conversations happen without words. "You okay?" she said, because some conversations still need words. "Getting there," he said. "I'll be better by noon." She nodded. She knew what these anniversary days cost him. Not in drama, not in the spectacular emotional reckoning that people who did not know him might have expected, but in a quieter toll, a low hum of something he could not entirely name. He had been through enough in his career to understand that you do not always get to name what you are carrying. Sometimes you just carry it until the day gets lighter, which it usually did by noon, which was why he had said noon, and why Elena had nodded because many years. The press conference was at 11. It was brief. Marcus kept them brief by design and by personality. He stood at the podium in the Precinct 9 briefing room with the posture of a man who had long ago stopped needing a room to validate him, and he delivered a progress report with the precision of someone who had actually done the work and was not afraid for the numbers to speak. Crime statistics down, meaningfully across every category that the department tracked. Community satisfaction survey results at their highest recorded level in the history of the survey, which went back many years. Officer retention up significantly from the year before the incident. Use of force incident data down substantially, with every remaining incident subject to a new mandatory review process that did not exist 2 years earlier. The reporters wrote it down. Some looked surprised. Marcus noted, as he always did, who looked surprised and who looked like they had expected this, and filed that information away, the way he filed all information away, not immediately useful but available when needed. 2 years ago today, he said near the end, and the room shifted its weight slightly, the way rooms do when the subject changes from data to history. I stood outside this building with zip ties on my wrists. He paused, looked at the room. I want to be clear about something for the record. On the 2-year anniversary of that moment, what happened to me was not the worst thing that has ever happened to a black man in America in an encounter with police. It was not close. What made it notable was circumstance. What happened afterward was not inevitable. It was chosen by a lot of people who decided to do their jobs seriously. He looked down at the podium for a brief moment, then back up. I'm proud of this department, not because it is perfect. It is not, and I will be the first one to tell you that every week, but because it is doing the work. That's all I ever asked. Sam Whitaker, the young reporter from the Gazette who had been covering the department for several months and still carried the slightly overwhelmed energy of someone who could not believe this was his actual job, raised his hand. Chief Ellison, do you forgive the officers who were involved in the incident? Marcus looked at him, not unkindly, more the way a man looks at a question he has turned over many times in private and has reached a precise conclusion about. That's a theological question, he said. I'm a police chief. I'll leave that to people with more appropriate expertise. Mild laughter rippled through the room. He let it settle. What I will say is this. His voice shifted, not louder but denser, the way a river gets denser when it narrows. I chose not to let what happened to me define what happens here. That is not forgiveness. That is strategy. Forgiveness is personal. Strategy is professional. Every decision I have made in this building over the past 2 years has been professional. The personal stuff, the things I carry on an April morning when I'm watching my daughter try to park a car that belongs to me and my family. What belongs to the city is the work, and the work is getting done. Sam wrote all of it down. He wrote so fast his handwriting became illegible in 2 places, and he had to reconstruct the quotes later from the audio recording on his phone, which he had remembered to start barely 30 seconds into the press conference. His article ran the following morning under the headline, 2 years after the poll, Chief Ellison says Carlisle is not the same city. It was the most read story on the Gazette's website since the original incident. The comment section ran to dozens of entries before the moderator closed it. And for once, for genuinely once, in the history of that comment section, the majority of those entries were not arguments. They were people from Carlisle describing what they had seen change. Small things, street-level things, the kind of things that never make national news, but are the actual texture of whether a city is getting better or getting worse. A woman named Cheryl Moreau from the Delmar Street neighborhood wrote, "He came to our block last fall to talk. Just talked. No agenda. Stayed several hours. That doesn't sound like much, but it never happened before. Not once in many years." That comment got hundreds of likes, more than any other comment, more than the article itself. Marcus Ellison drove home that evening to the house on Maple Grove. Jada had finally, on her 12th attempt, parked the car cleanly in the driveway. She had sent him a photo of it with 3 exclamation points. He had texted back a single thumbs up because he was a man of precise communication. His son Callan had baseball practice that weekend. His daughter Nyla was mid-argument with Jada about something involving a streaming show that Marcus had never heard of and did not intend to investigate. Scout, the golden retriever, required dinner and expressed this requirement by sitting directly on Marcus's left foot the moment he walked through the door. Normal life. His normal life. The one he had driven toward one morning 2 years earlier in a silver Ford Explorer, a sealed envelope in his jacket pocket. The city of Carlisle spread out in front of him like a question he had chosen to answer. He fed the dog. He helped Callan with geometry homework. He sat with Elena on the back porch after the kids were in bed and the night was quiet enough to let it be quiet. By noon, just as he had told her, he had felt better. By evening, he felt like himself. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The metal signpost outside Precinct 9 still stands. It was repainted the following summer. Routine maintenance, nothing symbolic, though every journalist who mentioned it in a story felt obliged to mention the repainting as though it meant something. Maybe it did. Most things mean more than one thing if you are willing to stand and look at them long enough. What the incident left behind was not tidy. Real reckonings never are. Derek Harlan, unemployed and divorced, moved to a small town in eastern Kentucky, where he reportedly worked for a property management company. He gave one more interview a year after conviction, in which he said he had spent a lot of time thinking about things. He did not say what conclusions he had reached, and the interviewer did not press him. Sometimes you run out of useful questions. Seth Langford found with time a version of life that he had not expected and might not have chosen, but was forced to inhabit. He stopped talking about the incident publicly. Some people who had known him said he seemed different. Others said he seemed the same. The truth was probably neither and both. Nolan Pierce returns to the force after his suspension, completed his probationary period, and requested a transfer to the new Community Liaison Program. He spent the following year and a half in the Delmar Street neighborhood, the same neighborhood where the incident had occurred, doing the unglamorous, necessary, often awkward work of being a police officer who was trying to earn trust that had been violated long before he arrived. He ran into Elena Vargas once in front of the corner store where Marcus Ellison had bought his water bottle. It was a Thursday afternoon, and she was picking up a prescription for her grandmother, who had recovered well from her hip surgery and had recently taken up pickleball, which Elena found inexplicable and Dorothy found invigorating. Nolan and Elena looked at each other for a moment. "Officer Pierce," she said. "Ms. Vargas," he said. Neither of them said anything else. There was not anything else to say, and there was too much to say. And the gap between those two facts is where the work of actually living in the world takes place. Not in the grand statements, not in the press conferences, not in the viral moments and their long echoes, but in the ordinary intersections of people who share a neighborhood and a history, and the ongoing, unfinished project of figuring out how to be accountable to each other. Elena went into the store. Nolan walked back to his patrol car. Above the door of Precinct 9, the sign still read Carlisle Police Department, its paint fresh and its metal solid, indifferent to everything that had happened in front of it, and everything that would happen next. The story you just heard is not a fantasy. Every element of it, the arrogance, the cruelty disguised as a prank, the video that changed everything, the reckoning that followed, mirrors documented real-world events that have played out in departments across this country. Names were changed. The arc was not. Here is the truth. Accountability happens when people refuse to look away. Elena Vargas hit record. That changed everything. You are watching this video right now, which means you are the kind of person who pays attention. So pay attention. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. Because the Derek Harlans of the world survive in silence, and silence is something we choose. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, thoughtful, or both, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we tell the stories that do not get told quietly enough, and leave a comment. What do you think real accountability looks like? What would you have done at that poll? Let's talk because the conversation is where the change begins. Do not just watch.